It has been really such a privilege and such a pleasure to be working with Jennifer and the city and the staff at the Imperial Center to make all this happen, to talk about artists in a space that is all about art making. Problem solving requires creativity. So the question really is, what's holding us back? Distrust of each other? Fear? Stuck in outdated or outmoded processes? Cross Currents was designed to be just like those jumper cables. The idea that if we truly want to understand how to transform community, we can't just think about top-down interventions. We have to engage at the level of social behavior. Ed Catmull claims that if we can remove the dynamics of power from every conversation, then we enable a celebration of messiness, which is always, in his thinking, a mind toward clarity. It is Josh Shank, who is our closing keynote, is a curator, essayist, author, and most recently published The Powers of Two, Seeking the Essence of Innovation in Creative Pairs, which he will be more than happy to autograph for you upstairs after his talk. He's actually no stranger to the nuanced dimensions of how we interact in order to reach shared connections for greater good. In addition to pondering, researching, and exploring issues of creativity and one's own muse, he also spends time leading and supporting creative communities. Like other creatives, he recognizes that our most brilliant ideas are the product of collaboration, in which we see our shared environments from different perspectives and expectations. In discussing core transactions with a statistician friend of mine, he remarked, "Everything is correlated to everything else." And I'm sure that we will all be able during Q&A to ask Josh what his multiplier is. It is really an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce Joshua Wolfe Shank to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you all for being here. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. Today, I want to unpack the idea that relationships drive creativity in three ways. First, I want to help you see just how much this is true, how relationships are to creativity what electric wires are to a modern house, often buried in the walls, not just hidden, but hidden by design. But without them, the lights won't go on. Second, I want to look at the lessons of epic creative relationships for how to connect better, more deeply, and more effectively. And third, I want to consider how relationships teach us something much bigger than about what happens between any two people, about how relational thinking can inform how we think about creative cultures and organizational exchanges. Okay, so let's start from the beginning and how relationships are the great untold story about how meaningful work gets made. Untold largely because a culture fixated on ostensible lone geniuses neglects the true stories of partners behind the scenes. Everyone knows George Lucas, but very few know the relationship between George and Marcia Lucas. An accomplished film editor, Marcia was the quiet guru of the Star Wars films, warming up with humor and softness her husband's cold and often technocratic vision. She had an uncanny sense of narrative and was one of the few people that the immensely headstrong director would take direction from. A sign of Marcia Lucas's influence. When she and George worked together, he made American Graffiti, the Star Wars trilogy, and the first Indiana Jones. After they split, his first movie was Howard the Duck. which I've never seen, but it is famously one of the worst movies of all time. It's on all the lists. Everyone knows Martin Luther King Jr., but very few know the man often called his twin, Ralph Abernathy, King's partner from all the way from the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968. Indeed, when King died in Memphis, he was on the balcony of a motel room often called the King Abernathy Suite, for the two men stayed there together so often. Everyone knows Vincent van Gogh, but most would be surprised that the work attributed to him was, from Vincent's point of view, a co-creation of he and his brother Theo. The Van Gogh brothers were like aspen trees entwined at the roots. They had supremely distinct roles, styles, and identities. Vincent was the irascible painter, the consummate Mr. Outside. Theo was the visionary art dealer and inspiring Mr. Inside. But from their separate domains, each contributed to a joint project of honest, daring art. Now I feel, Vincent once wrote his brother, that my pictures are not yet good enough to compensate for the advantages I have enjoyed through you. But believe me, if one day they should be good enough, you will have been as much their creator as I, because the two of us are making them together. The list of hidden partners goes on and on. I could offer hundreds of examples where a member of a true duo has received insufficient credit, as when Linus Pauling won the Nobel Prize for nuclear activism that his wife Ava Pauling actually led him into. You'll see that the uncredited wife or spouse is a trope of this conversation. And once credit is assigned for any body of work, the Matthew effect takes hold. You probably know the source from the Gospel of Matthew. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. The sociologist Robert Merton found that when two scientists collaborated, whoever was better known got the lion's share of the credit. And if two scientists came up with an idea separately at about the same time, the one who was better known received far more recognition for it. The problem here goes well beyond particular examples of hidden individuals. Every field has hidden job categories, critical roles that go unappreciated by the public at large, even as they are dearly noticed, even obsessively attended to by insiders. Outside of the book world, very few appreciate the role of the literary agent, say, or the book. Still actually know the stories about how, for example, a woman named Ursula Nordstrom connected with a young window dresser at a toy store called FAO Schwartz in 1950, gave him his first illustration job, developed him to the point where he was writing his own books that he was also illustrating, and received an idea from him at one point to write a book called Where the Wild Horses Are, and discussed it with him back and forth. It was problematic because he actually couldn't draw horses, and out of this exchange, this young artist, illustrator, hit upon the much more promising idea of wild things. And that's how we have Maurice Sendak, who was edited by Ursula Nordstrom all the way through. Many hidden job categories pretty much make sense when you hear about them. Oh yeah, the engineer is important to making record albums. Oh, of course, there is a philanthropist involved in this major nonprofit. I understand, yes, there's a CFO who is critical to running a tech company. But sometimes with these hidden jobs, it really is surprising and confounding, and it almost seems like a made-up story. Consider, for instance, the caddy in professional golf. I thought of them as burly men with no qualities beyond the strength to carry bags. In fact, at the top level, they serve as chief strategists and psychologists to their players, Tiger Woods' caddy for 11 years was not only a source of sage advice about shots. At times, he thought he needed to get Tiger's blood up so he would taunt him. At other times, he deliberately misled him when he thought it would improve his play. For example, at the 2000 PGA Championship on the 4th round and on the fairway of the 17th hole, so a critical hole, the golfer needed a birdie to catch the leader, and his caddy had calculated 95 yards to the flag, but he told his boss 90. He saw that Tiger was overshooting, and he thought, he's going to overshoot this, so I need to tell him it's fewer yards than it actually is. Tiger's distance control was a problem, the caddy explained. So I would adjust yardages and not tell him. On this particular hole, Woods hit the ball within 2 feet of the pin and went on to win the tournament. And the caddy said he had been giving his boss incorrect yardages for the better part of 5 years. For my book, I looked at hundreds of relationships where, in one way or another, two people shaped something bigger than either could have done on his or her own. Many were hidden partner types of the sort I've shown you. Others were hidden in plain sight, two people known for their distinct work, but where their relationship is not well appreciated, as with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the Narnia books, from Lewis, and Lord of the Rings for Tolkien, both, of course, extraordinarily well appreciated, but not for their relationship, which was seminal. Another example, Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, two giants of the art world, but their intense friendship and rivalry that really drove both, and which each credited for the heart of their success, is very poorly understood. I also looked at many cases of overt collaboration, as with James Watson and Francis Crick, who co-discovered DNA, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who created the modern women's movement, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I wanted to know what made these relationships work, and now I want to share with you some of the lessons I learned. First, embrace difference. The person who is least like you offers you the most potential for growth. You do need to be comfortable enough to work, and comfort does flow from similarity, but most of us tend naturally to similar people. In the same way that a compass points north, most of us find our inner direction pointing towards people that we have a lot in common with. We need to be attentive and effortful to find people who jar us, who challenge us, who stimulate us. 2, nourish a sense of us and we. A relationship is its own life form, and when it gets enough water and sunshine, it will begin to give off flowers. You know a relationship is blooming when there's trust. But trust takes time and attention to develop. What helps it along? Well, for one thing, many people underestimate the significance of creative propinquity. I just love that word. It really just means nearness, but it's such a beautiful word. And I was just in a spelling bee fundraiser for my son's school, so I'm really drawn to these words, like propinquity, Propinquity. Of course, I'm looking at it on the screen. There is a very basic need to be near enough to the people we work with. Of course, email can be helpful and the phone is good, but mere language and even voice can be narrow pipes for the kind of data that needs to pass between people. Several communication studies have shown that gestures are more than 4 times more important than words for human beings to understand each other. And it's ironic that Google and Facebook and Yahoo and Apple all emphasize direct in-person interaction for their own companies, even as they profit from virtual exchange. And we could even say encourage the illusion that it can replace another kind of contact. You may have seen in the news when Marissa Mayer took over as CEO of Yahoo, she forbade telecommuting, which was a little bit controversial because people were wondering if that was discriminatory in some way, but it was a very clear decision. And when you look at Silicon Valley, that really is the norm. They don't want people at home. They want people in the scrum of the office. Third, take your position on the team. People work well together when they develop niches and areas of expertise. One player on a team will be better at throw-ins. Another player will be the best at penalty kicks. Recognize and respect what the other person does best, and recognize and respect yourself. All manner of tasks can be divided and conquered. Who is the best spokesperson? Who keeps the spreadsheets? What decisions require full buy-in from both of you, and which ones can be deferred to the person who knows best? Which leads to the fourth point: lead and be led. Every pair has its own power dance, a choreography of thrusts and parries, of dips and turns that shapes its way of moving across life's stage. As a social species, human beings usually need to know who is in charge at any given moment. Ironically, the best way to empower a whole team is to recognize who has authority over any discrete decision. If everyone shares power equally, it is likely that no one will be empowered at all. And yet the best bosses know just when to defer. I think that's what John Lasseter is talking about when he talks about trying to eliminate power from the room. I think he is imagining, one of the circles that they have at Pixar. I'm sure all of you know Pixar is such a famous creative culture, and many of you know the products of it, The Incredibles and Toy Story and Ratatouille and all these great movies. And it's true, the lowliest writer on staff is encouraged to speak up, and the most senior person in the room is very good at listening. But that doesn't mean that power is out of the room. It means that there is a joint decision. There's a decision from the person who has less power to assert, and there's a decision from the person who has more power to defer, to step back. But you also will see, if you look closely at that culture, that someone has the power to move the ball along. And I think that we need to pay attention to that, because I think there is this myth of equality and democracy, and it's if you look at functional cultures, and even if you look at functional pairs, usually there is some degree of dominance in critical areas, and that's important, and that's okay. And as I say, one person can have more power, and both people can be empowered. And it's important, I think, to get comfortable with both positions. Finally, fight well. Fight well. This is a quote from Wilbur Wright, of course, who created the first flying machine, as they called it then, with his brother Orville. He said, "I love to scrap with Orv. Orv is such a good scrapper." Conflict is an organic part of the creative process. That is the bad news. The good news is that conflict is not necessarily bad. Psychologists have found that high indices of conflict are positively associated with an experience of intimacy. Jabbing with another person can even be pleasurable, especially when the product is good. And the most troubled couples are not those who fight the most, but those who have given up. And here's how the lyricist Alan J. Lerner described the end of his work with the composer Frederick Loewe. They had made My Fair Lady and Camelot and many other musicals together. Lerner wrote, "Too much was never said. In the end, we were a little like the couple being discussed in one of Noel Coward's early plays. Do they fight? Said one. Oh no, said the other. They're much too unhappy to fight." I admit that these practical suggestions often carry within them a real complexity. For example, to develop a relationship, you do need enough time in the same room, but you also need enough solitude. And the artists among us will certainly appreciate that. The fact of relationships is not contrary to the need to be yourself and to have sufficient alone time. Indeed, that is integral to relationships. And if there's any trope I've heard more often than any other at weddings from wise rabbis and ministers, it's for these couples who are joining into this sacred and hopefully eternal bond to respect each other as individuals. And that is a part of a relationship. And so there is that contrary and that tension there. And though we often thirst for absolute advice, the most skilled among us recognize in our bones the truth of what the Zen master Suzuki Roshi said: if it's not paradoxical, it's not true. The relationally talented know how to choose nimbly from among a series of opposite moves. Exert power, exert humility. Show up as part of a we, show up with every ounce of an idiosyncratic I. We can no more advise on a relationship from afar than we can tune a piano without listening to the string. Does it need to be flattened or sharpened? The key revelation from creative pairs is learning about which knobs control which strings in the first place, learning how they get twisted in one direction or another. Some problems we can get better at. Some problems we mainly just need to know are problems a lot of people have. Perhaps the most comforting and galvanizing English words are, "I understand." It's hard enough to deal with a fundamental challenge. It can be insane-making when we mistake it for a challenge that is somehow particular to us, when we consider it bad luck or a personal failing. If you're struggling in your relationships, you're in good company. If the most critical bonds in your life bring you both exhilaration and heartache, you are in good company. If you fantasize about having less difference, less conflict, less need to reach across an expanse, you are also in good company. But reaching across that expanse is the critical work. It's not just that relationships drive creativity. Creativity itself is a relationship. So far, we've looked primarily at duos, and these are relevant units because critical work does often happen between two people. But they are also, these pairs, helpful as a metaphor, as a mnemonic device. That's M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C, a word I so didn't know how to spell that I couldn't even look it up in the dictionary. I had to Google it. Helpful as a metaphor, as a mnemonic device, even as a parable for what creativity is. The heart of creativity is the intersection of distinctions. Distinct worldviews, distinct cultures, distinct allegiances. And now I'm from California, so please forgive me when I say distinct energies. The fertile regions in our culture come when these vast distinctions meet. When outsiders work with insiders, when traditionalists butt up against innovators. Perhaps the most elemental dynamic is between order and disorder. And for an illustration of this felicitous juxtaposition, let's consider John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And this description of them from a man who literally spent years peering out at their partnership from behind glass. This is from the Beatles engineer Geoff Emerick, and you all, I'm sure, know the name Abbey Road. That was the studio that they worked in London, and they were in a big room with wood floors, the size of a small gym. And up the stairs in the control room was Geoff and the producer George Martin, and he was looking down at them and listening to them through his headphones for years and years and years. He was the engineer on most of their records, and this is what he said, trying to get at John Lennon and Paul McCartney. He said he always thought the artist, this is Geoff Emerick speaking, I always thought the artist was John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And he used artist singular and then named the two of them. And looking inside what made them work, this is what he had to say. Paul was meticulous and organized. He always carried a notebook around with him in which he methodically wrote down lyrics and chord changes in his neat handwriting. In contrast, John seemed to live in chaos. He was constantly searching for scraps of paper that he'd hurriedly scribbled ideas on. Paul was a natural communicator. John couldn't articulate his ideas well. Paul was the diplomat. John was the agitator. Paul was soft-spoken and almost unfailingly polite. John could be a right loudmouth and quite rude. Paul was willing to put in long hours to get a part right. John was impatient, always ready to move on to the next thing. So the dialectic here has many names. We could call it rough and smooth. We could call it the brash and the impeccable. We could call it the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The critical point is not what we name the dialectic, but the fact of the dialectic, the fact of these two things joining to make something bigger than either one of them, and joining in a place of tension, in a place of excitement, and staying distinct, even as they are pushing against each other to create this thing bigger than either one of them. Nietzsche said that this relationship between the Apollonian and the Dionysian was the essence of creative work, and modern psychology has hit on the same key relation between making and breaking, between challenging and refining. The essential tension, notes one psychologist named Frank Barron, between two seemingly opposed dispositional tendencies: the tendency towards structuring and integration, and the tendency toward disruption of structure and diffusion of energy and attention. So that's very abstract, but I would think about how that applies in your own field. Think about what institution or organization or person is basically responsible for tradition, for things being done according to some kind of order. Maybe it's the person who's got to bring the budget in on or under budget. There's just there's no way around that. Or the person who is responsible for executing a set of laws, and it's simply impossible for them to be violated. And that person in relationship with someone whose whole orientation is to challenge, is to say, well, why can't we do it this way or that? To look at rules and try to understand how to break them. Well, you really need to have both those people in a room. And as I've been saying, it's not necessarily any two people. It may be those two forces representing two different organizations. This is also important, as much as we will sort of, stereotype the guy with the green eye shade, to understand that person can also be a wild and creative thinker. Very often the work of an accountant or the work of a budget person is to think about things in a very unusual way. And it's also important that we don't stereotype the artist as someone who's just constantly throwing things up against a wall, because no artist is able to make things work without rigor, without discipline, without attention to form and tradition within his or her own field. In fact, if you look at creative individuals as individuals, if you take these dialectics that I've talked about in terms of pairs, in terms of two people like John and Paul, and I've also talked about in terms of organizations, in terms of these sort of broader forces, this same dialectic actually happens inside the mind when we are working well creatively. There's a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi who's responsible for this idea called flow. And he looked at hundreds of very high-level creative thinkers, Nobel Prize winners and MacArthur winners and all these kinds of people. And he tried to understand what made them tick and what they all had in common. And what he found is the main thing that he saw over and over again was this ability for complexity and to be able to move between these apparently diametrically opposed states, between order and disorder, between simplicity and complexity, between sanity and craziness. That it's not that he didn't find that creative people sort of split the middle, but they could go back and forth between these extremes. And I identify this with this. For me to come up with a good book idea, I have to, on the one hand, just be a little boy lying in my bathtub, just dreaming, what do I want to do? What images am I preoccupied with? What are the what are the stories that I want to tell, and forget about the world and forget about what anyone needs of me or wants of me and forget about making a living. If I don't really love it, I'm not going to be able to show up for that work for 2 or 3 or 4 years with a totally uncertain outcome and the almost certainty that there's going to be humiliation in the process. So I need to fully go to that place. But I also then fully need to go to the place of practicality. Who's going to edit this book? Who am I going to work with for this book? Am I going to have access to the materials? What kind of literature, what's the tradition that I'm drawing on? What kind of book is this? Is this like Joan Didion? Is this like E.B. White? And I need to be rigorous, and I need to study those things. And in these two extremes, and there's a conversation in my mind when I'm working well between these two extremes. One side says, well, how about this? Say this is the little boy thinking. That would be really neat to get to spend your days studying chemistry and relationships like John Lennon, Paul McCartney. How neat would that be? And the other side says, yeah, and you know how I could do it? If I really studied these epic pairs, then I might develop enough authority to be able to say, this is the truth, this is how this happens. And so the one side is just an impulse and a desire to think about this stuff, and the other side says, this is how it could work in the marketplace of ideas. And this is the cover of the book and the spine of the book that someone like Janet Kagan might read and say, this guy knows what he's talking about, and I'm going to have him for my conference. So you all may be thinking about individual relationships. You may be thinking about what's going on in your head. I know the work of this conference and the very important work you're doing fundamentally has to do with fields and the relationship between fields. And however you do it, I want you to, if there's a single thing to take away from this talk, it's how much every distinct place in this, in the creative world needs another place. Every field needs the other field. Artists need engineers, and engineers need artists. And philanthropists need artists, and artists need philanthropists. And I wonder if you could just call out, there are a number of people doing a number of different things in this room. Are there philanthropists in the room? If you could just say yes. People who are working at nonprofits, who basically have money to give. Yeah, are there people who are working in city government in the room? Are there people who are fundamentally artists in your own practice or in a small group? So you all need each other, and coming together, you will find the expanse, and you can cross the expanse. If you are bold and ready to take infinite risks, you can recognize the need to be in this relationship. And when we embrace how complete this truth is, we see that creativity is not a thing. It's not a noun. It really is a process. It's not static, it's dynamic. And there's an unfortunate tendency to see two disparate elements butting up against each other in fearful terms, to fear that another person or group or culture is going to subtract from what you have, take away from what you do. But this is usually an error, and certainly if we are looking to these examples of great creativity, the canon of Western civilization, that's not how it gets made. It doesn't get made from that place of fear. It's also an error to look at another person or group or culture in terms of what they can add to what you do. That's not the equation either. The math here, the possibilities in juxtaposition, is not arithmetic, it's exponential. It's not 1 minus 1 equals 0, and it's not 1 plus 1 equals 2. It's 1 plus 1 equals infinity. Thank you very much.